afternoon. I'm Michael Darren, the coordinator for Japan House. On today's Japan House Shares, we will be focusing on the art of origami. Simply put, origami is the art of folding paper. I've always been amazed at how something like this colorful piece of paper can be turned into true pieces of art. We will be talking with local artist Mark Hirsbrunner, who will be showcasing some very advanced designs today, as well as making one for you from start to finish. Over the years, I have been able to help with some origami here at Japan House, teaching classes on making simple things like the butterfly, a heart, or even a unique gift box. But I had the distinct pleasure of working with Mark last fall at our annual Matsuri Festival, where Mark and I created a large-scale crane, similar to this one, out of a piece of 12 by 12 paper. We want to thank Mark for coming here today and showing us his skills on modern origami.
Hi, my name is Mark Hirsbrunner. I'm a graduate student at the University of Illinois and an amateur origami artist. I've been folding paper since I was about 10 years old, and I'm excited to share all my knowledge about modern origami with you today. First, I'll give a brief history of origami, and then I'll move on to discuss the differences between origami instruction, which is what most people are familiar with, and the origami design process. Finally, I'll go into detail about two important design techniques that are fundamental to modern origami. Origami is a traditional Japanese craft and historically was used in ceremonies and rituals. Traditional origami has existed since around the 1700s and consists mainly of designs many of you have seen before, like the crane and samurai helmet. These days, it's mostly a craft for children, only ever using a few basic folds. Things changed drastically in the early 1900s when Akira Yoshizawa reinvented origami. He was a worker at a metal factory and was tasked with teaching new hires about geometry. He used folding metal as a teaching tool and eventually found he enjoyed folding and started doing it at home with paper. He became so passionate about folding paper that he quit his job and became a full-time origami artist, probably the first one ever. His work is incredibly detailed thanks to his deep understanding of paper folding. It is also extremely lifelike and expressive because of the technique that he invented, which is called wet folding. But what has happened in the decades since then? As you can tell from these pictures, a lot has changed since then. Modern origami seems to have no limits in complexity, detail, realism, and creativity. The secrets of paper folding have been unlocked, and origami is now a true art form. We can fold beetles with endless legs, we can fold compositions of multiple subjects, like the gecko, the fly, and the wall that they're both on, from a single sheet of paper, and even reimagine famous paintings like the Scream. But how is this possible? How did we get from traditional origami to hyper-complex modern origami? The answer is basically just math, but we can ask a better question. What goes into designing an origami model? First, we have to understand the difference between following instructions to fold an existing model and the process of designing the model itself. I suspect almost everyone has folded an origami crane at least once in their life, and that meant following instructions like these. Each step uses symbols to communicate exactly which folds to make and in what specific sequence to go from a square of paper to the completed model. It's not hard to imagine designing a crane step by step, but what about a complicated beetle, for example? No one can just sit down and come up with a series of steps to make a beetle out of a square of paper. It's too complicated. Instead, origami designers work backwards. Imagine unfolding this beetle back to a square of paper. What's left behind is a complicated set of creases called a crease pattern. In reality, the crease pattern is what origami artists design. The crease pattern entirely determines the shape of the final model, and complex mathematics lets artists predict what the final shape will be. It's only after the crease pattern is created that the artist can figure out how to sequentially refold the paper into the model. This probably seems a little bit crazy, if not impossible, so let's take a step back and look at something simpler. On the left, we have a relatively simple origami maple leaf, and on the right, its crease pattern. If you unfold this leaf while keeping track of where the paper goes, you'll find that each leaf corresponds roughly to a circle of paper on the square sheet. This mapping between circles in the paper onto leaves, or more generally onto flaps of paper in the finished model, is the basis of a powerful design technique called circle packing. Circle packing is a procedure that starts with choosing a subject to fold, and ends with many connected flaps of paper that can be sculpted into the subject. Once the subject is chosen, the next step is to abstract it into a simple stick figure. Each stick in the figure will correspond to a flap of paper in the final model. Then the sticks are translated into circles that are packed into the square of paper. These circles are then further translated into a crease pattern, which can then be collapsed into the flaps. From there, the artist molds the paper into its final form. The method of mapping stick figures into circles and circles into crease patterns involves complicated math, and turning a crease pattern back into the stick figure requires technical skill and lots of manual dexterity. The rest of the process is entirely artistic. It's basically sculpting, but with paper as a medium instead of something like wood or marble. Let's see how this process works out visually. Let's say we want to fold a dog. Dogs have 4 legs, a head, and a tail, so that's basically 6 flaps. Those flaps and the corresponding stick figure are shown in the figure. Once we have a stick figure, there's an algorithm that turns the stick figure into a circle packing diagram, and then turns the circle packing diagram into a crease pattern. Here, the ends of each stick are labeled, showing where they end up on the paper, and how the crease pattern connects those points. The algorithms behind this were partly invented by a physicist turned origami artist named Robert Lang. He also wrote computer software called TreeMaker that does all of it for you automatically. But, as you can see here, it's still very complicated. With the crease pattern in hand, the next step is to collapse the model. This basically means doing all of the folds at once, which isn't as impossible as it sounds, and turns the paper into the collection of flaps. In this case, the resulting base has a few small flaps at the top, a lot of long flaps at the bottom, and a short body in the middle. Any guesses what it could be? Give this to an origami artist and they could turn it into a tarantula. Pretty amazing, if not a little bit creepy. This technique has one major problem. What if the subject you want to fold can't be turned into a stick figure? What if you want to fold a train, for example? Turns out that's no problem at all. We just need another technique. The box pleating technique involves using creases to divide the paper into a square grid. From that grid, it's possible to fold out boxes and flaps of paper into arbitrary arrangements. The image on the right shows the creases that were used to fold the train on the previous slide, and the image on the left is depicting how a rectangle of paper can be folded into a box of paper using this technique, although it's a little hard to visualize. To get flaps of paper from the grid, you start by pleating the paper like a fan. Then, by pulling the fan apart and folding the paper inside back and forth on top of itself, it's possible to turn a single pleated flap into 2 or more flaps. Combining the boxes and flaps lets you create just about anything. These are a few examples of complex models that use box pleating. It's especially clear in the Thunder God shown on the left. The grid of creases is apparent all over the model, which is one drawback of the technique. I spent much of this presentation talking about what modern origami is and the process that goes into making it. It's indeed a very technical skill, but I don't want to give the wrong impression. Origami is an art form, and to convince you, I want to share some of the work from my favorite artist, Eric Joisel. Eric was a French artist who never identified as an origami artist. Rather, he identified as a sculptor who chose paper as his preferred medium. I don't have much to say about these pieces. I think they speak for themselves. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and that it's inspired you to try out origami. Thank you so much for watching.
Please join us every 2 weeks as we introduce a new Japan House shares. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.